Thank you. I think that's Karen Curry, I think, who just is put in the chat right now from AARP. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, well, why don't we start? Because there's so much that we want to pack in, and we definitely want to get to our special guest as well, too. Hello and welcome today to the AARP Stop Asian Hate panel, backing up our AAPI elders with data. So we're addressing the anti-Asian hate from a very specific lens, and that's around data today. My name is Daphne Kwok. I'm Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for the Asian American Pacific Islander audience for AARP. This event is being recorded, and you can access the recording on our social media through our Facebook community page on AARP AAPI later after the event. Give us a few minutes, a little bit of time to post after this session. For more than 60 years, AARP has been working relentlessly to promote the health and well-being of older Americans. Now we are using the AARP channels and platform to be relevant to our AAPI constituents. Welcome to this important discussion about anti-Asian hate, particularly how data is a key to helping organizations and policymakers to better serve and communicate with older Asian and Pacific Islanders. Data, data, data. AAPI data, especially disaggregated data, is how we're going to bring the attention and financial resources needed to advance our community forward. And over the past year and a half, we've seen an increase in hate incidences, particularly those against our elders. AARP condemns social injustice in all forms as part of AARP's brand promise to protect and serve older Americans through continuous education about racial inequity and its impact on 50+ older adults. Thank you to all of our AAPI community members, allies, colleagues, and others for joining us to have a critical discussion to learn more about the important work of AAPI community-based partner organizations. A special shout out to our AAPI Asian media partners who are with us today. Their service to our community is invaluable. Today, we're going to discuss the mental and health effects of COVID-19 on older AAPIs, self-reporting of AAPI hate incidences, and the impacts of hate incidents on AAPI women 50+. We have with us a panel of experts who will address these topics from a research lens to shed more light and reveal what is really happening to our AAPI elders at this time. And after the presentation, our panelists will take your questions via the Zoom chat. I want to let our participants know that you can type your questions in the chat box. We have our panelists answer your questions after the first half of this event during the Q&A. For those of you who are joining by phone, unfortunately, we will not be able to take your calls and questions. If you would like to ask a question, we encourage you to click on your Zoom invitation link and participate through our chat room. At this time, I want to welcome our special guest for opening remarks, Deborah Whitman, Executive Vice President and Chief Public Policy Officer at AARP. And why did we invite Deb to join us today? Because under Deb's group is AARP Research, which has been tackling two of the major issues around AAPI research, the lack of AAPI research, as well as the challenges around the methodology. And she's also the executive sponsor for our AARP AAPI Employee Resource Group, providing leadership for professional development training, empathy, and support through especially the last 2 years of the anti-Asian hate. Welcome, Deb, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you to everyone on the AARP AAPI Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team for hosting this event on the inequities in Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders communities and how we can better support them through our work. During the last year, it is undeniable that we've seen an increase in xenophobia and anti-Asian hate, especially towards community elders. It's hit close to home. My sister-in-law, Junko, moved to the US from her home in Japan to marry my brother, and they live in Washington State. She shared stories with me about being yelled at in the supermarket and told me my nephews had been called names on the street. I've heard stories from my friends and colleagues about similar encounters, which has made them reluctant to leave their homes. Tragically, these hateful attacks haven't stopped at verbal assaults. My heart was heavy when we learned about the mass shootings in Georgia, the violent beatings of elders walking in their own neighborhoods, and many other incidents in this country. So I want to be clear today that I stand in solidarity with the AAPI community and condemn these acts of violence and racism. And I hope you know that all of AARP condemns all racially motivated violence and harassment. In the face of all this tragedy and hate, though, I have been heartened to see scenes that are born of love. Across the country, Asian American communities have come together to help their neighbors, deliver food and support, and build new connections. And it has brought needed attention and awareness on the long history of prejudice, hatred, and xenophobia towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'm so excited to kick off today's conversation that will showcase data and insights about the hate incidents that are targeting our API communities, and especially our elders. Data is a powerful tool in telling impactful stories. As you just heard Daphne say, data, data, data. But a persistent lack of data in the AAPI communities prevents us from telling the whole story. Disaggregated data is critical because it gives us insights beyond the general population and helps us understand what's really happening in every community. Now, ARP is committed to including more data on AAPI communities in our research. In fact, part of my team in ARP research is working to address the needs of the AIP community research methodology, both on the supply side, making sure that our providers of data can provide us with the information that can be disaggregated, as well as on the demand side, so that more and more of us use this data. In 2018, we hosted a 2-day convening with more than 20 experts to advance AAPI research methodology. And now we're starting to work with NORC to develop a panel for doing accurate surveys of the communities. This session is also part of AARP's commitment to fulfilling the Association of National Advertisers Alliance for Inclusive Multicultural Marketing pledge to take a stand against hate and violence targeting the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I want to commend all of our incredible speakers today for their leadership in shedding a light on these issues, but also for working to develop solutions to help their communities. I look forward to the discussion, and I'm passing it back to you, Daphne. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Deb, and you truly have been a tremendous ally for us internally, the staff of AARP, but also as externally, as you said. And we're very, very excited about the work that our AARP research team will be doing and will be adding to the field as well, too. So thank you so much. Now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists who will speak about their organization's latest findings. And again, I just want to remind people that for those of you who are tuning in, you can ask your questions to the panelists through the chat box. We have our guests answer the questions after they do their presentation. So I ask each and every one of you now to listen closely, take notes, think about how you might be able to use the data for your advocacy work, for your funding requests, to write your stories for those in the media, to help debunk the model minority myth and the perpetual foreigner concept, which has been so detrimental to our community, especially during this time. So our first panelist I want to welcome is Dr. Van Ta Park, who is a professor at the University of California, San Francisco's Department of Community Health Systems. Her primary research interest is to address issues related to racial and ethnic minority health and healthcare disparities, especially among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Her research areas include mental health, Alzheimer's disease, and related dementias around caregiving and precision health. So Van, we're so excited to be able to hear about your COMPASS key findings, which you are the lead investigator. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, Van.
Thank you so much, Daphne. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Great,
Yes.
thank you. Well, I am so delighted to be here, and I'm so grateful for this invitation by AARP. It's also excited to be in great company and with other panelists here. So as Daphne mentioned, I'm the principal investigator for COMPASS, and COMPASS stands for COVID-19 Effects on Mental and Physical Health, AAPI survey study. Next slide, please. So COMPASS launched in October of last year, and our goal was to actually recruit about 2,500 participants across the US to answer or complete our survey about COVID effects. And as you can see here, we had a great response, which really, I think, speaks to the interest of our community, our diverse AAPI communities, to share their experiences with us via the survey. You can see here that the age range is 19 to 98 with a mean age of 47. We separated out for the purpose of this presentation and our audience the age breakdown for older AAPIs by 50 years old and also 65. So almost half, actually, 47% of our participants were 50 years and older, with about 17% who are 65 and older. If you look at the map, about 2/3 of the responses came from Western parts of the US, which mirrors really where a lot of AAPIs live in the US. And you can also see the breakdown of gender, with 2/3 or almost 2/3 of respondents being female. 67% said they were born outside the US. A quarter of our participants reported that had limited English proficiency. Our survey was made available not just in English, but in also simplified and traditional Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Samoan. This study was, by the way, funded by the National Institute on Aging and via a COVID admin supplement. And about 15% of our participants indicated they were caregivers. Next slide, please. So for this slide, it's a lot of information, and it speaks about the key discrimination findings. You can see here that 3 in 5, so 60% of all our participants reported that they have experienced discrimination in the past 6 months, which coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic period. And when we asked the participants how COVID-19, the pandemic, has changed their life, 41% said they have increased negative experience with racial discrimination. So, trying to compare their previous or pre-pandemic experience with their current experience. And for older adults, it's 34% of older adults said the COVID-19 pandemic has changed their life in terms of racial discrimination experience. And then you can see here on the chart to the right, the 8 items that we asked in regards to discrimination experience. We've asked in the past 6 months, how often have ... because you are Asian American, or Pacific Islander. And that's a really important part of the question. And so you can see here, you've been treated with less respect than others. We stratified the findings by sometimes or often, rarely, and never. I do want to comment, though, that although there are people who said rarely, we should never dismiss even the experiences of rare, okay, especially if they had never experienced or did not notice previous discrimination against them. So, but you know, for the sake of data, we always want to disaggregate data, but you can see here sometimes, often, rarely, and never. And going down, people acted as if they're better than you. People acted as if they are afraid of you. Just a comment about what discrimination means. Discrimination refers to acts and mistreatments because you are ... And in this case, it's because you are Asian American, or Pacific Islander. So it's racial discrimination. Next slide, please. So my last slide here speaks or talks about racial bias. And different from discrimination, racial bias refers to our beliefs and judgments that are often informed or associated with stereotypes and prejudices. So again, discrimination are acts, and bias refers to our belief system. So we asked a question about the percent who strongly or somewhat agree with these beliefs you see here concerning how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected AAPIs. What's really alarming when we first saw the findings is what you see in the first line, where 59% said they believed the country has become more dangerous to their ethnic group. So, and then among those who are older, our older respondents, about 45% said that, okay? And then you can see the other kinds of racial bias items here. And I think one thing that I want to definitely point out, as you can see on the bottom, that is that we have to interpret these findings with caution, okay? Both discrimination and racial bias. Because in some ways, in order to experience discrimination, you might have to leave your house. And if you are fearful of leaving your house because of catching COVID, or even because of what you see, from on media to your networks about anti-Asian hate, you are then limiting your opportunity or the opportunity for potential discrimination experiences and things that may affect what you think in terms of racial bias. So I don't want to go through all of this due to time constraints, but you can see here that for both discrimination and racial bias findings, they're extremely alarming. I hope, through this discussion here today, we can have a thoughtful conversation together about what we can do and what should we do with this data. Thank you.
Thank you, Van. I think what you brought up, especially, and we need to remember this, the difference between discrimination and racial bias. As you said, discrimination are acts, and racial bias are belief systems. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that we really need to remember is the rarely, that we cannot dismiss those that responded rarely. So thank you so much, Van. Okay, just a reminder again, if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat and we will get to them shortly. Our next panelist is Russell Jung. He's a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. I'm sure all of you have heard about them. They've gotten so much tremendous press in the last year and a half. And they're a coalition that was founded back in March of 2020 to track and respond to the incidences of hate, violence, harassment, discrimination, shunning, and child bullying against AAPIs in the US. And the coalition's made up of three very distinguished organizations, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, Chinese for Affirmative Action, and Russell's organization, and he's with the Asian American Studies Department at San Francisco State University. where he's a professor. And the department uses interdisciplinary approaches in teaching, community service, and research to address the structural and ideological forces that shape the lives of Asian Americans. And Russell, I remember when I was living in San Francisco, you were so kind enough to invite me to speak to one of your Asian American Studies classes, and I do remember that very, very distinctly. So welcome, Russell.
Thanks, Daphne, and thank you for speaking to us and for organizing this great event. I also like to thank AARP and Ms. Whitman for also hosting us. And it's good to see so many family and friends already in the chat. I'm surprised to see so many individuals that I know here. And thank you, TW, as well. Last year when, could you go back to it before we talk about the data? Last year when COVID-19 news was coming out from, I was pretty alarmed because I knew from Asian American history that whenever diseases come from Asia, Asians face blame for those diseases and then face interpersonal racism and racist policies. And like this is addressing, I knew we needed data to address the racism, to document the racism, and to hold government accountable for the racism, and to be accountable for the public health and safety of Asian Americans. I also know that that we needed data to change people's hearts and minds, right? The data is really helpful in changing people's thinking about what's happening, to undermine the model minority thesis that Asians don't have problems. That data is really helpful in that way. But data is also helpful in changing people's hearts, that if we could tell the stories of Asian Americans, if we could amplify and center the voices of Asian Americans, then that would not only impact people's thinking, but also develop empathy with Asian Americans. And so we launched this website to collect firsthand accounts of racism that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders experienced during COVID-19. And immediately we were flooded with hundreds of incidents, and they were just harrowing. I was just shocked at the vitriol and anger directed towards Asian Americans. And to help you sort of, as listeners, get a sense of what's we're hearing on a daily basis nationwide, I'm just going to read a few of the incidents that we've received from elders. These are all people over 65. And you don't often think of Asian American elders going online and complaining about racism. But they are, and they're recognizing mistreatment when they experience it, and they're wanting it to stop. They may not want individual redress, but they want to develop a collective voice. So put yourself in the shoes of these Asian Americans who've reported. Customer began screaming at me for no reason while online, and I was correctly distanced at 6 feet. I am mostly Chinese, and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since the 1860s. I'm fourth generation in San Luis Obispo, but guess I will never be an American. I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verified the incident in which elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey. F you, Chinaman. Go back to China," bringing that China virus over here. My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then she said, "You need to go back to where you came from." We were shocked to hear this. I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. The child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. The mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977. So, next slide, please. As you hear these stories, we have to date over 9,000 of these stories. Our data is self-reported, And it's clearly just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Park just talked about how 3 out of 5 of her respondents have experienced racism in the past 6 months. The Pew Research Center found that 45% of Asian Americans experienced direct racism in the past year. So our incidents are really just a sample of what's happening, but I think the trends are pretty clear. And as if you look at the chart, the types of racism aren't all hate crimes for which you could be prosecuted and arrested. They fall under 4 major categories. The bottom 4 indicate civil rights violations. Asians are getting mistreated at the workplace. They're getting denied ride shares. In the middle, online harassment is another category that mostly affects young people. Our recent youth campaign found that over half of Asian American young people have experienced or witnessed online racism, racist posts, trolling of Asian Americans using those slurs. On the top, you could see the microaggressions that Asian Americans are experiencing: verbal harassment and avoidance, the deliberate shunning of Asians because people think we're diseased. But these aren't necessarily microaggressions. What we found in our survey of our response is that 1 out of 5 respondents who experience this racism now report racial trauma. And this is a diagnosis. Racial trauma is 3 or more symptoms, long-term symptoms of issues like anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and avoidance of places. So, half the community is experiencing racism, 1/5 are going through racial trauma. The rest of us, I would argue, are going through collective vicarious trauma. When we see these incidents of attacks against our elderlies, we see ourselves or our own families involved. And so this is I think, a period of historic collective trauma, similar to Japanese American incarceration, and that it will have long-term impacts. And the 4th category is that we are getting assaulted. We're getting pushed and shoved. We're having bottles and rocks thrown at us. People cough and spit on us. So people ask, how do you know racism has increased over the past years? And I say, in 2019, I didn't hear of people spitting on their fellow American. But you could see on the chart about 8%, 9% of our respondents experienced that. My own wife experienced it. And the most disturbing fact is that we are getting assaulted physically. And most disturbingly is that vulnerable populations are more likely to be attacked. You see that on the points on the right. Women are attacked twice as much as men, youth are more attacked, and elderly are also attacked. And in this chart, you can see elders are attacked at twice the rate of the general Asian American population. It could be just that they report the more severe incidents. We have 7% of our respondents being over 60 years old. That's less than the national sample. Nationally, about 10% of the Asian American population is elderly. But because Asian elderly tend to underreport, the fact that we actually got 7% indicates that there's probably, again, the disproportionate targeting of our elders. Next slide, please.
Russell, before you move on to the next slide, there was someone that's asking you, what are the asterisks signifying here?
The asterisk shows those are statistically significant differences. So the fact that Asian American elders are twice as likely to be assaulted shows that being elderly is a major factor in why they're being attacked. And statistical significance. Okay, next slide. So the impact of racism on our elders has been really, first of all, deadly and traumatizing, but has other adverse impacts, especially on their mental health. What we're seeing is that both the pandemic plus the racism together, the fear of their safety has led to the greater isolation of our elders. That isolation is a self-isolation. It's also families telling them to stay indoors. And that leads to both physical isolation and social isolation. And the problem with isolating is that they're more safe, but then they also have more mental health issues. They could get more depressed, they could be more lonely. And for Asian Americans, they may also experience it somatically. right? That's how they experience mental health issues. So Dr. Park shared a statistic about the numbers of people who think the US is more dangerous for our community. You could see on the top chart, those who experienced racism, 100%, almost 98%, they know America has been more dangerous for Asian Americans because they've experienced it. They're just knowledgeable that, yeah, it's clear the US is more dangerous for Asian Americans. And you can see in the bottom chart that those who experience racism experience more anxiety than the rest of the population. So here's my scary takeaway fact. When asked what's their greatest stressor during the pandemic, Asian Americans who report to Stop AAPI Hate overwhelmingly say that they're concerned about racism. So think about this. Asian Americans are more concerned and more anxious, more fearful of other Americans and their hate than they are about a pandemic that's killed 600,000 people. Initially, they were worried about the pandemic. Now they're more concerned about the violence. You can vaccinate yourself against the pandemic, against COVID-19, but you can't put on a mask to protect yourself from racism. You can't get vaccinated from racism. And that's why I think our elderly are isolating and then have the subsequent mental health impacts. Okay, last slide. And like Ms. Whitman said, I'm really angry at what's happening across our country. I'm really saddened for our elders. But again, what's heartening is that the Asian American community has really resisted, has really stood up, and has made change. And here are just 3 ways where we've made change. We helped the Senate to pass the hate crime legislation 94-1. President Biden has issued a few executive orders to address anti-Asian racism. And in California, the legislature passed an API equity budget. This is historic. They funded $157 million to address racism and the inequities that Asian Americans face. It's actually, first of all, acknowledging that we face inequities, disaggregated inequities, disparities in education, in mental health, in supporting our seniors. And not only do they acknowledge it, but they're putting money to address it, funding over $110 million to community groups who are serving elders, to serving victims, to providing educational opportunities. So I think that's a model for the rest of the nation that, not only do we denounce the racism, but we got to put our money where our mouth is and actually address the racism in concrete ways. So I look forward to the conversation ahead and seeing how we could work with AARP to further promote the safety and health of our elders. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Russell. I think what you said, we really need data to change people's hearts. And I think as you started off with those very, very powerful personal stories from individuals, well, wow, powerful, very, very powerful. Thank you. Our third panelist is Drishti Pillai, and she's a research manager at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which was founded in 1996 by AAPI women who recognized the need for an organization that would amplify AAPI women's stories and experiences. They focus on building power with AAPI women and girls to influence critical decisions that affect their lives, families, and communities, and create social, political, and economic change. And they very much were drawn into the Atlanta murders. Today also is a very special day as well because the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum has just released an issue brief that is historic. An issue brief that specifically focuses on the growing political power of Asian American Pacific Islander women voters 50 and older. Within the survey, there is rich disaggregated data about our AAPI women's perceptions of not just voting patterns, but also their beliefs on key issues such as ending racial discrimination and immigration reform. And today, Drishti is going to share with us a portion of this very important study, which focuses on the racial discrimination. Drishti?
Thank you for your introduction, Daphne, and really grateful to be here with this amazing panel. So as Daphne mentioned, the results I will be sharing today come from this larger study that we just released on our website, napof.org, which looks at the voting patterns, policy priorities, as well as the experiences with anti-AAPI hate, discrimination, and the overall impact of COVID-19 on AAPI women who are 50 years of age and older. So if we go to the next slide, I can kind of give a brief overview of the study. This poll is, to the best of our knowledge, the largest survey of AAPI women ever conducted. The overall sample of over 3,500 AAPI women is a fully nationally representative sample, and this includes over 1,300 women who are 50 years of age and older. So that's the sample that we will be looking at today. Respondents, either identified as Asian American or Pacific Islander, and the interviews were conducted, in addition to the English language, they were also conducted in Mandarin, Korean, and Vietnamese, so that we were able to include the most widely spoken Asian languages in America. The time frame for the interviews was between February and March of 2021, so really at the height of the pandemic, right before the mass shootings in Atlanta. Throughout the results, I will be breaking the samples down into subgroups based on ethnicity. So for East Asians, I will be referring to Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Taiwanese women, 50 years of age and older. South Asian includes women from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Southeast Asian includes Filipinos, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Hmong Americans, Thai, and Laotians. And Pacific Islanders includes Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. So if we go to the next slide, we can dig into the findings about anti-AAPI hate and how they impacted AAPI women 50 years and older specifically. So just like the figure that really stands out is that over 70% of AAPI women 50 and older reported that anti-AAPI racism had impacted their lives in the last 2 years. This number jumps up to 76% among East Asian women and Pacific Islander women, 50 years of age and older. So, when you think about this is 7 in 10 AAPI elders that you meet on the street who have been personally impacted by anti-AAPI racism. The ways that they experience racism are varied and nuanced. It can range from experiencing racism or harassment at work, which was particularly high among Pacific Islanders at almost 20%. It also includes being called a racial slur, feeling unsafe walking outside, something that Van touched on earlier. This was especially high among East Asian women 50 years of age and older at, again, at around 20%. When we look at these findings, it's also important to ground this in the overall findings of our study, which also looked at, voting patterns and policy priorities. So what we found was that 80% of AAPI women 50 and older reported that they voted in the presidential election. This number is significantly higher than the national turnout. So we have to recognize the fact that elderly AAPI women are a growing and powerful voter bloc. So it's important to take their needs and their experiences into consideration. And the top issue that they wanted the Biden administration to address was ending discrimination based on race, gender, ethnicity. Over 75%, again, across all subgroups, said that they want the Biden administration to work towards ending discrimination. So it's really important that we ground our findings in this, overall understanding that AAPI women are forming an ever-growing share of the voter bloc, and this is something that is very important to them. If we go to the last slide, we can look at the overall impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to hate, its impact on just economic well-being, health, mental health, wellness. Again, there were some really striking and nuanced experiences across the different subgroups. Some of the ones that stand out are, 28% of Pacific Islander women 50 and over reporting that they lost a family member or a loved one to the pandemic. It includes 13% of East Asian women reporting the same. It also includes job losses. So around 10 to 12% across all the different subgroups reported that either they or a member in their household lost their jobs as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is especially striking when you think of the age group of this population. So these are individuals 50 years of age and older. This is also striking when we think about long-term unemployment. NAPOF did a separate study which looked at long-term unemployment rates, which basically refers to an individual who lost their job being out of the workforce for 6 months or longer, and found that 44% of AAPI women who had lost their job during the pandemic were long-term unemployed. So again, these are really striking numbers, and this problem continues to persist. Around half of these people are likely still without a job. Yes, so these are some of the main findings around anti-AAPI hate, discrimination, the impact of the pandemic on our elders. But we have many other nuanced findings that you can access on our website, napof.org, which include, voting numbers, how AAPI women 50 and older preferred to vote, the methods they used, who they voted for, the key issues that they want the administration to address. Yes, and I really thank you for holding this space.
Thank you so much, Trishti, to NAPOF for really adding to the better understanding of our AAPI community, especially from the women's view. We want to provide a few resources to you as you may be asking where to obtain support for our AAPI elders. What you're seeing on the screen includes resources from the Department of Justice, such as up-to-date news and translated resources, and community relations services for the AAPI communities. The Department of Justice Community Relations Service just released their toolkit of information. So hopefully that can be a good source of information. We also have listed the Asian American Foundation's Rapid Response Toolkit, which is available as well. If you're looking for guides on hate crimes and hate incidences, there's a guide on the DOJ's website, in addition to Stop Hate, action steps for local communities, hate crime reporting, and a guide on improving the identification and reporting of hate crimes. So these are just some of the resources that are available. And of course, many of the organizations have resources as well too. So let's first go and take some questions. I'm going to kick it off with one question I have for the panelists is, you have all this tremendous data right here. What is your next research, or what are some of the research that you're focused on right now at this time?
If I may start, thank you for the question. I do want to share, I guess, happy news that we recently learned that we will be receiving funding or have received funding to follow up with our Compass participants. And I think, as we all know, it's important to understand how COVID has affected us long-term or over time. I don't think any of us anticipated COVID to last this long, and it's pretty clear that there are long-term and will be some serious long-term effects, and we really need to better understand that.
We at Stop API Hate really appreciate working in collaboration with others. So we did do a report with Drishti and NAPOF on women's concerns. I'm working with UCSF again on how elderly are self-isolating. And I'm pleased to report that we're working with AARP to issue a national report on the impacts of racism on our Asian American and Pacific elders. That'll come out hopefully in the fall. We also plan to do a report on Asian Americans' concerns about returning to work, what fears they have about the pandemic, about commuting to work, microaggressions they may experience at work, that type of issues.
Like Russell mentioned, we also do a lot of work in partnership. For example, our partnership with Stop AAPI Hate, that report was released in May. We have also done some work around long-term unemployment, which can be accessed on our website, and how it impacts AAPI women. Our policy team is constantly working on making recommendations to different agencies within the federal government on better data collection and data disaggregation standards so that we can truly understand how experiences vary within the AAPI community. In terms of research projects in the pipeline, we are hoping to dig deeper into wage gap analysis for AAPI women across different ages, across different industries of occupation, starting next year.
So everybody be on the lookout for all of this tremendous data that will be coming out. Van, I have another question for you as well too. How have the hate incidences resulting from discrimination and racist beliefs impacted AAPI elders in other ways? How has it manifested itself?
I think that's a good question. I don't have all the answers, but I do want to mention that with Compass, we work with the reason why we were able to get more than 5,000 respondents was from all the hard work from our community partners. And in our discussions with community partners, they have definitely shared what they have heard from the ground level and via their own respective clients. And it's really disheartening to hear some concerns in everything from in the early on in the pandemic, I don't want to wear a mask because then I will be calling it more attention to myself in terms of the anti-Asian hate, to I'm scared to get tested. This is before the vaccine was available or in December, and I'm scared to get tested again, calling attention and so forth. So I think one of the things that we have to do as a community together is be very careful with how we interpret the data we see. For when we see data earlier on about, for example, low rates of COVID-19, is that really true? How do you get tested? How do you know that's true if people aren't getting tested because they're too afraid, to be out in public, for example? So I think these are all, and then of course, with Asian Americans, we know that there's a high need for multilingual resources. And so communicating, what's real and what's, all the misinformation and so forth. And certainly as it relates to their safety and security that they might be feeling or having thoughts about, we have to collectively need to put it out there and communicate like we are here today in this panel about the importance of disaggregated data, as well as providing the appropriate opportunities in terms of people being able to respond about their needs and what their experiences are in the languages that they speak and read and write.
Thank you. Russell, there was a question about what was the what was your data set for your research?
We had, our most recent report had over 9,000 self-reported incidents, and of those 7% were reports from elderly. And so we compared the elderly reports to the national sample.
Great.
And then secondly, we also did, again, with the Asian American Psychological Association, they did a national needs assessment, and then we surveyed our Stop AAPI hate respondents with the same survey on their mental health concerns.
Thank you. I think it's so great that you've been partnering with so many of the key organizations in our community. So thank you. We have a question here. Are there any support groups for victims of hate attacks? And I open that up to any of the panelists. Are there any support groups that you know of for victims of hate attacks?
I mean, locally, I know there's a lot of work going on that is being done by grassroots AAPI-led organizations, including NAPOF. So when the spa shootings happen in Atlanta, we have local chapters, which includes a chapter in Atlanta. So we had our chapters in Atlanta, New York, hold healing spaces and organize events locally. I don't know if there's anything that exists, in a systemic way, but I know that locally there are so many, it's not just NAPOF, there are so many AAPI serving community organizations that are working on this now, but that have been working on this issue now for decades.
Okay, someone just put in the chat a whole group listing of organizations that could be good resources for support organizations on the ground at the local level. Okay, we have a question here from Angela Houghton in our AARP research department. And the question's for Van and Drishti. In your experience, have you seen any evidence that the rise in violence and racism has made people less willing to participate in your research, perhaps out of fear? Excellent question.
I think, that is an excellent question. I can only speak, I don't have quantitative data to back this up, but I have sort of qualitative, which is that I have heard from community partners. I'm also the principal investigator for CARE, which is Collaborative Approach for Research and Education, which is the first and only research recruitment registry targeting APIs. And so we've been, recruiting people in this pandemic, and certainly during the peak of the attention that we had in terms of anti-Asian hate via the media, we certainly weren't able to recruit very much and focus and do that, because the priority had to go and shift to the anti-Asian hate that people were really feeling, again, during the height of it all. And, I can't think about participating in research, for example, would be common response from people in the community. I don't, I'm fearful for my parents, I'm fearful for my grandparents, I'm fearful for myself and my kids. So it's this extra level of fear, and not just, oh, am I going to get COVID, etc. Right. So, we definitely had our experience with that.
I can speak to this anecdotally as well. We experienced challenges with regard to recruitment just because of, yes, the overall impact of COVID-19 and how that limits how we interact with one another. But we did find that somehow all of this heightened spotlight on anti-API hate and racism at some level empowered a lot of the community members to start sharing their experiences. It might also help that we have been working in these communities now for decades. So, having people that look like you, that speak the same languages that you do, may help facilitate that discussion. But yeah, we have found consistently that now a lot of AAPI women are finding the courage to find their voice and to start sharing their experiences more as a result of an increase in hate crimes. And a lot of that credit goes to organizations like Stop AAPI Hate, who have made it easier to start reporting. I know there is a lot of data that suggests that AAPIs are unlikely to report to authorities for fear of retaliation, and that is very much true. But I think it's the amazing work that community-based organizations are doing. So we have found it, we have had a good experience engaging with community members and having them open up about their experiences. But I think, when it comes to reporting crimes at the federal level, I think it is still a lot of work needs to be done. It's still very much an underground because of fear of retaliation.
Thank you, Van and Drishti. There was one question I saw about bullying, and I just want to put out there, Act to Change. My good friend Malik Pancholi, the actor Malik Pancholi, started Act to Change a couple years ago, and they are very focused on the bullying aspect. So I encourage you to go to acttochange.org to find out more about the bullying and how to combat bullying. I see another question here about any discussion about how to respond during an attack and training on what to do when the incident is happening. Very much so. There is a bystander training offered by Hollaback, as well as with Advancing Asians, Advancing Justice. So those two organizations have been doing a lot of training, bystander training, the Hollaback, and we can put that. It looks like someone's putting that in as well too. the chat. There was a question about media. How can media companies help support this initiative? So thank you so much for that. Very important question. I'll put it out to our three panelists. How can the media help you all? Russell, do you want to take that one?
Sure. We think for us, narrative change is really key to pushing for racial change. And that idea of narrative change is that we have to disrupt a lot of the stereotypes that Asian Americans face, whether we're perpetual foreigners who don't belong, whether we're the model minority who don't face. And so getting our data out to media, telling the stories, and for us at Stop API Hate, we know people who've been impacted by racism, and having them become spokespersons themselves of what's been happening has been really powerful. I've noticed that the reporters who ask questions or who report on anti-Asian hate, they're Asian American. And unless we had Asian Americans in the newsroom reporting on our community, that story wouldn't be told. And so it's been really imperative to have Asian Americans at the decision-making tables in politics, in the newsrooms, and in the boardrooms to participate. And yeah, I really credit actually Asian American journalists raising up the issue, amplifying it, and then getting policymakers to pay attention to the issue.
And to just add to what Russell said, I think it's important that media houses share, the full experiences of the AAPI community. Like Russell said, like AAPIs are not just American when they're winning medals at the Olympics. AAPIs are also Asian American, are also part of the American society when, they are experiencing high rates of poverty or food insecurity. I asked this question to people, when we talk about Suni Lee winning the gold medal, how many people know that the poverty rate among Americans is 38%, staggeringly high. So it's making sure that we are intentional about the stories that we highlight about the community, and that we highlight all the experiences, like the full lived experiences, and, so that we don't perpetuate this model minority myth and recognize AAPIs for who we are, including our struggles.
Okay, great. This one is for Russell. Has Stop AAPI Hate shared information worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has been tracking hate crimes ever since its inception?
Yeah, again, like we're trying to partner with everyone we can. And we have consulted with the Southern Poverty Law Center about data gathering. We were going to work on a school bullying project with them, but they actually stopped that project. So we're looking for partners on a lot of levels.
So if any of you have very specific angles that you want to help support, you can reach out to Russell. One question here, what resources do you recommend to support this discussion in other Asian languages? Is the internet the best resource? So in-language materials.
I think, it's, of course, we all recognize how important it is to have in-language materials. And we also recognize how important it is to be careful with our limited resources. So in that regard, I think for us to be aware about what already exists and who's doing what. And so I know, for example, one of our partners is NAPCA, National Asian Pacific Center on Aging. They have a lot of great different kinds of materials, and I know they're really active in this area as well. And so, but one thing I want to comment on, it's not just important to have in-language materials, but to disseminate that in-language materials. So those who typically would need the non-English language materials are more likely to have less access to digital technology. So they would need, hard copies, or they would need information via ethnic media, related to the question earlier about what media can do. They would need, other ways to get that information.
Thank you. There was one question. Okay, go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dr. Park said about the need for in-language resources. Because Stop API, I think we started with five different languages. Now we have 15 languages available, including Pacific Islander languages. And so 5% of our respondents are in those languages and are limited English proficient communities. And so we're really committed, again, not only to providing access, but then developing resources that are translated, accessible, easy to read. And then also sort of the outreach goes through ethnic media channels, through Kakao or WeChat and other ethnic modes. But for elders, and a lot of it is working through family and friends and networks, and so senior centers. And so we're trying to be culturally responsive in how we develop materials, the language we employ, and then how they get disseminated.
I saw one question early on about, do you know what the statistics are about who the perpetrators are against the AAPIs? Is there any one particular group that has been the main perpetrators, or is it across the board?
I myself don't have that information. I think that I know that in the media, sometimes certain individuals are portrayed, and I again would want us to be cautious about trying to highlight or that kind of narrative because it might be false of in portrayal of who the perpetrators are. One, because there as we all know, there's underreporting, and of incidents and experiences. Also, how and what things get chosen to be, shown in media. I think that's something for us to be aware about as well. So I guess I feel like the priority should really be about the experiences of the victims and how and why, the context of it all for the victims and how we can inform others of our experiences. I saw a previous message in the chat about, why share this data? Why are we, highlighting AAPI's experiences? And I think it's important to highlight that because we need to share our experiences. We need to make it be known that we are not the model minority that is problem-free. And it's not it doesn't any way communicate to the outside that, we're not empathetic towards others groups, or that we're trying to be competitive with other groups either for attention. It's just that it's important for non-Asians to know that we're experiencing this, but it's also important for our own Asian American communities and AAPI communities to feel able and safe to and invited to share our experiences. So, yeah.
I know that there was that one question about, is it African Americans, are they the main perpetrators? And actually, John Yang at Asian Americans Advancing Justice actually talks about how it isn't necessarily the African American, that actually, unfortunately, we have been the victims due to attacks from all people. So actually, Asian Americans Advancing Justice does have that statistics. I don't remember immediately what the statistic is, but he actually testified on Capitol Hill a couple months ago, and that it wasn't just African Americans. But this is really something that we have to continue to tell the truth, identify who all the perpetrators are, and it's not a specific group. I know we're starting to run out of time, and boy, this is really exciting. We've got so many questions coming, and they're coming fast and furious. So I will take one more question, and it's here. How AAPI hate may be based in white supremacy, but some incidences are by other groups. Many, including our district attorney, ignore these because they aren't white people. How do they suggest we address without scapegoating other groups? Does anyone want to take that one?
So
Russell?
even, oh, Russell, you
Okay.
can go ahead.
Sure. Okay. First of all, using our data, most of the hate incidents aren't hate crimes for which you could get prosecuted. And so using our data, that then says, if the problem isn't hate crimes, but it's racism across the board in a wide range of places like schools or streets or online, then we need a comprehensive approach. And so our data says we need a comprehensive approach to stem racism where it comes from. And so we want to get at the roots of racism rather than the end, going downstream and putting band-aids like hate crimes enforcement. We want to prevent the racism from getting to that level of a crime. And for us, that includes education like ethnic studies. It's expanding civil rights protections. In California, you could get mediation services from the state in language if you get harassed at a place like a store. So that's expanded civil rights protections. And we're really advocating for restorative justice. Restorative justice doesn't punish perpetrators. A lot of times perpetrators are young people. You don't want to put them in prison, but you want to educate them. You want to help them understand the harm they committed, and then help them develop empathy for Asian Americans. And in the same way, we Asian Americans, we could learn to be racist. We could learn to become anti-white or anti-Black, right, as we experience racism. So for us, we need to also have restorative justice so that if we're victimized, we have a voice. We also develop empathy for maybe our perpetrator and understand them better. So we push for restorative justice models rather than hate crime enforcement. And for them, it doesn't really matter who the perpetrator is. It's us as a community coming together instead of saying, oh, these people are racist and we're not, but we have to address the issue as a community.
Thank you. Dristi?
And I totally echo what Russell said. I just also wanted to drive home the quick and important point that even when these incidents are perpetrated by another person of color, usually the root cause is still white supremacy. It's this idea of pitting minority communities against each other by perpetuating this model minority myth about Asian Americans. So the root cause is still white supremacy. That is still what we need to work towards. But I completely echo what Russell said about restorative justice as opposed to punitive justice.
Wow, well, thank you. We have had such a rich conversation here today. Tremendous comments and questions coming in to our panelists. I encourage you to go to our resources. I encourage you to keep in touch with us and with additional information that is needed. I really want to thank Russell, Van, and Dristi for joining us today. And I hope that for the audience, that we're very grateful for your time. We hope that you have taken away data points that will be useful to you and your work, also resources that will be useful. To our panelists, we're so grateful for your commitment to ensuring that the true picture of the needs and challenges of our community are told. We need all to pull together to rebuild our communities that have been ravaged by the twin pandemics, COVID and the anti-Asian hate. And so before I give the last remarks, I just want to ask each of our panelists in one sentence, how would you like to close out today's session from your viewpoint? So Dristi, what about you? One sentence.
Making sure that the intersectional lived experiences of AAPIs are fully and accurately captured.
Dan?
I think, this panel presentation exemplifies the fact that we need data and we need disaggregated data, and we need to work collectively to help our community members share their experiences and be research participants so we can have better data.
Absolutely. We all encourage people to be participants of research, and if we're asked, that we actually say yes as well too. Russell?
I love how our community values and honors our elders and believe we have so much to learn from we get that chance.
Thank you. The recording of today's event, as we said, will be posted on our AARP AAPI community Facebook page, and that's at AARP AAPI. Follow us, please, on Facebook and Twitter at AARP AAPI as well. And for more general information, you can visit us at aarp.org/AAPI. For our Chinese partners and members of the community, you can visit us on our Chinese.aarp.org page, where we have a lot of materials translated into Chinese. And if you have any questions or are looking for more resources about this event, please contact PR@tdwandco.com. I want to thank you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. And at this point, this concludes our event. So thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.
Wow, we had so many questions. That was really tremendous. There's so many we didn't get to, but thank you all for your time. Russell, there's a lot of good information there as well.
We are waiting for everyone to drop. Give me just a second.
Daphne, everybody, that was amazing. Thank you so much for pulling this together.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for staying with us. And as we can all see, that data, and the research is so important.
Russell, you're doing amazing work. Keep it up, please.
Okay, thanks, Deb. And thanks, Daphne. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll go ahead and close out on the meeting now.
Thank you.